Okay, back for part two. I want to say a couple more things about globalization and postmodernity as it moves to globalization. Globalization as a term is hard, as I said, is hard to define. I'm going to pull out an introduction to anthropology textbook that I use. I'm using this semester here at NAU. And it's a very general definition. The editor's a friend of mine. This is for a freshman course. I'm going to change it just a bit, but here's what they say. This is Nandan Worm's Culture Counts. Richard Worms is a friend of mine. Had breakfast with him, or lunch with him last weekend. He says, globalization is, and I'll put this in my notes so you don't need to write it down right now, the integration of, and I'm going to add, and participation in resources, labor, I'm going to add ideas, and capital in a global network. Let me repeat that. Globalization is the integration of and participation in resources, labor, ideas, and capital within a global network. Globalization thinks about what does it mean to be part of, what does it mean to acquire ideas, material resources, and participate in a global system. Brief example of that. And globalization is not new. We've been doing this since people got into boats and started sailing around, but it's been accelerated by the digital world, which is why some people point to that as a significant marker in change in time. But in the world I inhabit, in Western Kenya, places I stay, when the Arab trade routes ran through the area, and Mumias, who was a leader in the area, converted to Christianity or Islam early on. And later, when the railroad, 30 kilometers south, opened up trade on Lake Victoria, what is Lake Victoria today? And with that railroad came access to the Banyare Hills and the Maragoli Hills. And so people, Church Missionary Society missionaries who had been in Uganda, then went up into this area in 1906 and started a school to teach chiefs' sons how to participate in Western society so that they could get jobs as clerks, as traders, to read, write in English. That's globalization. Now, people who are living in mud and wattle huts with grass roofs are now wearing clothes. A sign of participating in the Western economy, Western society, includes washing, clipping hair in a different kind of way, putting on clothes, putting on trousers for boys, learning to read and write, learning to work with the system of the Western colonial world. And part of that was a choice, and part of it was necessity, because the British had instituted a hut tax system. So if a man was wealthy by land, had a lot of wives, many huts, he was taxed for every hut he had. And in order to pay that tax, he had to have cash. In order to get cash, he had to have somebody participating in the economic system of the British colonial empire. That's an example of globalization. Jump ahead 106 years, and when earlier this week, I sent a note to my primary research assistant, and I talked to him about his schooling. How old was he when he had gone to school? Because I'd heard about a university that was offering some resources for undergraduates to come and study in the U.S. so that they could go home and help develop their community, develop their nation. He's 40 years old. Chances are he will not be admitted. But the fact that and so that's kind of sad, but the fact that I was able to send him a Facebook message and have him respond within a day or two is another example of globalization. And as I've watched him, I introduced him to Facebook. I introduced him to computers. Somebody else would have. But there was a computer lab at the university. The little seminary that I stayed at had a computer lab. So this man who lives with no running water, with no plumbing, indoor plumbing, with no electricity, lives by kerosene lamp, doesn't want solar panels because someone will steal them, doesn't want to appear too wealthy because then he will be accused of all sorts of treachery and things, but is very committed to helping the community, is now able to communicate with me, and it's been fun to, as I said, it's been interesting to watch him negotiate Facebook and reach out to people, friends of mine, and say, oh, I'm, Dr. Lampy's friend, and so I'd like to be your friend, and here's what I have to offer, opening a LinkedIn account, trying some other social media networks, and trying to be a part of this global world, all the while really participating. He's part of the Anglican community, but he also participates in what might be called a revitalization movement. Talked about that in the last video segment, where he relies on prophets who integrate Christianity and Jewish texts with traditional African ideas about how reality works. How do you deal with spirits? How you keep the community safe? How you maintain health in a community when non-health may be caused by somebody doing witchcraft against you, or somebody casting a spell on you, or somebody just looking at you wrong, or a spirit of an ancestor not treating you well. So he's a part of contemporary globalization. But he lives in Kenya, and so most of you won't meet him. But you may meet African immigrants. You may meet people who come from other parts of the world, from Melanesia, or right now the big immigrant community is coming out of former Burma. And a friend of mine who's a pastor in downtown Syracuse, that's the community he's working with. 5 years ago, it was the people coming from Somali immigrants, refugees. Before that, it was Sudanese. So you may have those in your neighborhood. Or now, probably today, it's going to be Syrians, Syrian refugees who come once this thing kind of gets settled. Because right now, 2 million people have fled and are living in Lebanon and in other places in refugee camps. So we're living in a postmodern world where we recognize that constructs of truth may be, there may be many perspectives on what it means to be human in the world. And we also live in a world that is deeply intertwined, deeply globalized. One other piece from Partridge, page 440, first full paragraph. Effects on society at large. Postmodernity may in theory appear to promote a newfound tolerance, since no subgroup is deemed to have the right to impose its values upon another. However, this may be illusionary. And here's where we go with the revitalization movements and others. Different ethnic groups, different genders, different class, and other professional interests all seem to operate with different criteria of truth. But this leads to the collapse of any dialogue that crosses community boundaries. Rational argument becomes reduced to manipulative rhetoric. People look in vain for some global vision or global overview. And then they go on to talk about new religious movements. As we move forward, we think about modernity, truth claims, exclusive truth claims. As we think about postmodernity and the listening of, heeding to, and honoring the stories of the Native Americans, the stories of Africans whose lives have been changed by colonization, by Melanesians who had a way of being in the world that has been changed by the introduction of Western economic opportunities. We enter into globalization, and that's what the Chambri are living in Melanesia in the Goest and Arrington book. That's what the people of Kenya are living today. Most of them rely on family members who are either living in cities to send money back, or people who are overseas, here in the U.S. or other places, and then sending remittances back. Part of the big debate about migration here in the Southwest has been people taking jobs that many don't want, but they do that so that they can send money back home. And much of what they earn doesn't stay in the U.S. Some of it does, but many send it back for their families. What I'd like us to do in this week in particular, and we'll talk about what this all means next week, is to go back to the text that we've read thus far, and with this last section of Partridge in mind. I'd like to look at the texts on their own terms. Let's not use them as metaphor to instill pull a Christian message out of it. Let's not use them and turn to, well, this is what's true and this is what's false. But to take them as narratives about people undergoing social change and the dilemmas they faced, and what that means for us today. What does it mean to, what I'd like us to do this week is to delve into what does it mean to live in the era of globalization, after postmodernity. What does it mean to live as people of faith who say, this I believe, but other people believe something else? What I'd like to do this week is to have you ask questions. I'd like to focus on, well, if this means this, then what does that mean for me? And the questions might revolve around truth, what it means to worship. It might revolve around economic disparity, because that's the big thing in globalization. We got a lot of people with with very little, and a few people with a lot. And I'm one of those. I mean, look at my bookshelf. We've got people who suffer at the hands of brutality, suffer at the hands of neglect, because it was only recently that HIV/AIDS became a priority in Africa in the last decade or so. So what does it mean? Rather than make assertions or say, this is what I think this means, go back to Goest and Arrington. Go back to Watiango, Ngugi, Watiango. Go back to Tracy. Go back to the Bowen, an early book. Go back to the Fiona Brereton chapter you read. Go back to Partridge and the different sections we've read about different religions. And ask some questions. And let's think about those together. That's what this course is about. To enter into the world of postmodernity. To enter into the worlds of others and take them seriously on their own terms. And then puzzle about what that means for us as leaders, as people who make faith professions today. So I'll be posting a written kind of summary of some of this, but mostly just an invitation to talk. And I'll ask a few questions to get us started. Look forward to the conversation.